They laughed when she brought her quiet, hoodie-wearing son into the investor meeting. They smirked at his worn sneakers, dismissed his presence as a mother's misplaced hope. But when she faltered, he stood, not to boast, but to reveal a truth so clear it shattered every doubt in the room. One moment of unexpected brilliance flipped their future, launching a revolution in how companies understand themselves. This isn't just a story of a pitch saved. It's the story of a boy who turned quiet certainty into a force that no one could ignore. They arrived 15 minutes early. Samantha had planned it that way, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted a moment of stillness before walking into the lion's den. The glass-paneled elevator took them to the 26th floor, and for a few seconds the city below blurred into streaks of movement, like the whole world was rushing past and they alone were standing still. Her son, Elias, stood beside her in a too-big blazer and worn sneakers, eyes fixed straight ahead, one hand in his pocket and the other gripping a tablet pressed tight to his chest like a secret. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't anxious. It was sharp, composed, focused. The investor conference room was larger than Samantha expected. Polished floors, sculpted light fixtures, a long white table lined with chairs filled mostly by men who wore tailored jackets and practiced expressions. They were mid-conversation when she walked in, laughter still hanging in the air from someone's offhand remark. A few heads turned. One man checked his watch. Another frowned at the sight of Elias. Samantha stepped forward with a polite but practiced smile. "Good morning. I'm Samantha Wells. This is my son, Elias. He'll be observing." "Observing," one of the investors echoed. He was gray-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who carried skepticism like a credential. "Interesting choice. Does he intern for the company?" "No," she replied evenly, "but he's been helping me work through a few of the more complex solution bottlenecks." That earned a light chuckle from the far end of the table. Another voice, smoother, said, "Well, I hope your solutions are a bit more adult-sized than your guest." She didn't react. Neither did Elias. He simply followed her to the end of the table, opened his tablet, and sat quietly. The presentation began. Samantha walked through the product first, Stream Core, a data optimization suite designed to help legacy logistics firms modernize without overhauling their entire back-end systems. She explained the market opportunity, the recent pivot from a B2C to a B2B model, the early traction from their pilot clients. She had practiced the numbers, anticipated the questions, refined the messaging. This was the moment that would decide everything. But as she moved from the product to the financials, she felt it. The mood shifting, polite nods, brief eye contact, a few murmurs exchanged behind coffee cups. They weren't sold. The lead investor, the same man who'd commented on Elias, interrupted gently as she transitioned into the technical roadmap. "Ms. Wells, I admire your clarity, and the product, conceptually, has potential. But I'm struggling to understand the defensibility. There are already 6 companies playing in this space. Your cost of scaling seems prohibitive. And frankly, your burn rate this quarter suggests StreamCore may not be viable past Q2 unless you pivot again. Do you have a strategy for that?" Samantha hesitated, not because she didn't have a strategy, but because it wasn't hers. Elias looked up. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't wait for permission. He simply spoke. "If I may." 8 pairs of eyes turned toward him. One man stifled a grin. The lead investor blinked. "I'm sorry." Elias stood, calmly. "The reason our burn looks high is because you're looking at standard cost metrics instead of functional return curves. You're using a model designed for SaaS scalability, not for middleware integration. StreamCore isn't meant to compete with platforms. It's meant to attach to them." Silence. Samantha turned slowly toward him. Elias continued, tapping his tablet. We analyzed 92 enterprise clients with aging logistics systems. 71% reported patch-based upgrades within the last year. 44% are already paying for support extensions on outdated core architecture. StreamCore doesn't replace those systems. It feeds them, optimizes latency, bridges legacy and cloud without disrupting workflows, which means we're not asking companies to migrate. We're making it easier for them not to. He projected his tablet to the room screen. A live model spun into view, a simulation that showed a logistics network with and without StreamCore integration. The cost difference wasn't subtle, it was seismic. But you're burning cash to develop features that don't exist yet, one investor said, voice sharper now. No, Elias said. We're simulating them against real client infrastructures, in-house. Every dollar spent is mapped to a measurable configuration test. We're not building and hoping it works. We're testing before we build, which means once we finalize, our deployment time is half the industry average, maybe less. Someone leaned forward. You're doing pre-integration modeling? Elias nodded. Client-specific ghost builds. That's the strategy, that's the edge. There was a long pause, and then the lead investor spoke again. And you built this simulation yourself? With my mom, Elias said. She did the architecture. I just stress-tested the models. Samantha hadn't moved. She barely breathed. She didn't know he'd been working on this version of the sim. She'd only seen fragments. Now here it was, streamlined, clarified, undeniable. The investor leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. That edge case you mentioned, Company 92. What was the latency delta under full load? Elias didn't blink. 8.2 seconds standard, 4.6 with StreamCore, and revenue projection based on reduced load times? 17% increase in client throughput, Elias said. Minimum? The room changed. Questions flew now. Real questions. Technical, financial, strategic. Samantha stepped in, answered, filled in the blanks Elias left untouched. But it was his words, his simulation, that shifted the tone from courtesy to curiosity, from rejection to belief. By the end of the meeting, the term sheet was in motion. Not because they liked the founder, because they finally understood the solution. Outside the building, as the wind picked up and the sky threatened rain, Samantha turned to Elias. He looked unfazed, back to scrolling his tablet. You didn't tell me you finished the integration overlay, she said. He shrugged. Didn't want to show it until I was sure it worked. She laughed softly, breath fogging in the cold. You saved that pitch. They didn't hate it, he said. They weren't listening. He looked up at her. They are now. They didn't talk much on the drive home. The silence wasn't awkward, just full. The kind of silence that sits comfortably between two people who don't need to fill the air with words because everything worth saying had already happened in that boardroom. Samantha kept one hand on the wheel and the other loosely resting in her lap, occasionally glancing sideways at Elias, who sat with his head leaned back, watching the blur of trees rush past the window. He wasn't smiling exactly, but there was a lightness to him that hadn't been there that morning. The kind of lightness that only comes after being underestimated and then proving everyone wrong in the most precise and undeniable way possible. They stopped at a diner on the way home, some small-town place with foggy windows and a chipped neon sign buzzing faintly overhead. The waitress called everyone "hon" and poured coffee without asking, and Elias ordered pancakes even though it was almost 3 in the afternoon. Samantha watched him across the table, the way he quietly reread the investor term sheet on his tablet between bites, scrolling with a thumb that still bore a smudge of graphite from all the sketching he'd done the night before. You realize what you did back there, she said finally, her voice low. He looked up. You mean talking? I mean turning the entire room around in 4 minutes. You didn't just explain a feature set, Elias. You sold the company. He shrugged, poking at the edge of his pancake. They just weren't asking the right questions. I answered the ones they didn't know they had. Samantha smiled. That's not nothing. The truth was, she had spent weeks preparing for that pitch, weeks modeling cost curves, refining the roadmap, getting the decks tight, and the positioning bulletproof. She had obsessed over every word, every data point, every possible objection. But in the end, it wasn't her polish that cracked the room open. It was Elias's clarity, his precision. The way he cut through all the noise with a few clean facts and a simulation that made everything feel inevitable. And he'd done it not to steal the spotlight, not to prove something, but because the problem bothered him, because he wanted to fix it. By the time they got home, the clouds had cleared. Sunlight poured across the front steps like a silent welcome, and the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds and vanilla from the pot Samantha had forgotten to empty that morning. Elias dropped his backpack on the floor, toed off his shoes, and disappeared into his room without a word. Samantha didn't follow. She knew him well enough to recognize the shift. After the intensity of building and presenting and responding, he needed silence. Not sleep, not food, just quiet. He'd come out when he was ready. She sat at the table, pulled up the digital copy of the signed term sheet, and reread it twice. The amount was higher than they'd expected. The valuation more generous. There was even a clause granting early access to partner networks, something she hadn't even requested. The lead investor had called her on the drive home to say they were excited about the partnership and eager to get started. But she knew what he really meant. They were investing not just in her, not just in StreamCore, they were investing in Elias. Later that night, she found him in the garage, sitting cross-legged on the concrete, with a half-dismantled router in front of him and wires curling out like seaweed. He didn't look up when she stepped inside. "You're rewiring the network?" "Rebalancing the signal distribution. We've got bandwidth issues when the house is under full load." Samantha leaned against the doorway. "You can take a break, you know." Elias didn't stop working. "Taking a break feels weird right now." "Because they finally listened?" He nodded. "It felt good," he said, "to show them something that worked, to not have to explain why I was in the room, just to be useful." She crossed the floor, sat down beside him, and picked up a stray wire. "You've always been useful." "Not to them." "Well, now you are." He looked over. "And if they stop listening again? Then you do what you did today. You show them the truth. Make it too clear to ignore." He stared at her, expression unreadable. "Is that what you've always done?" Samantha smiled. "I tried." They sat there for a while, the silence punctuated only by the soft clicking of tools and the hum of electricity overhead. She thought about the way he had stood in that boardroom, not with arrogance, but with certainty, not with rehearsed lines, but with a model that spoke for itself. He had shown them not just what was possible, but what was inevitable if they chose to stop pretending that potential and profit were the same thing. And now, because of him, everything had changed. The funding would carry them into full deployment. The client network would grow. The product would evolve. But more than that, the people in that room, the ones who laughed when she brought her son to the pitch, would think twice before doing it again. They would remember this day, remember the boy with the tablet and the perfect numbers. And maybe next time, when a woman walked into a room with someone too young or too quiet beside her, they wouldn't smirk. They'd pay attention. Samantha stood, ruffled his hair as she passed. "I'm proud of you, Elias." He didn't look up, just nodded once. "Thanks," he said. "Me too." The next morning came with the kind of stillness Samantha always associated with turning points. The sun rose slow and soft, casting amber light through the blinds across the kitchen floor, catching in the steam from her coffee like the moment itself was trying to be gentle. She sat at the table with her laptop open, the fresh funding report glowing on the screen, but her eyes weren't really reading it. She was listening to the muffled sounds of Elias moving around in his room, the way he always did when his mind was already 3 steps ahead of the day. Drawers opened and closed, a tablet buzzed once, the soft creak of his desk chair as he sat down. No wasted movement, no delay. He was building again. Samantha had seen this pattern before. Every time something important happened, when he first reverse-engineered her cost model at age 9, when he rewrote the diagnostic layer on her old prototype backend without telling her, and now, after the investor pitch, he didn't celebrate. He recalibrated. He returned to the work as if validation only meant he could finally get back to solving the problems that actually mattered. She respected it. She worried about it sometimes, too, because the world wasn't built for kids like Elias. Not really. It had made space for him, sure, but only after he forced its attention, only after he made himself undeniable. They had a full day of follow-ups scheduled. A virtual call with the new advisory team at noon, a legal consult to review contract clauses, and a product design sync in the late afternoon. Samantha had expected to have to drag Elias into at least one of them, but when she knocked on his door, he was already dressed and scanning his schedule. "I moved the product sync up an hour," he said. "We're losing time waiting on the API vendor. I want to rebuild a test case while we still have clean traffic logs." She blinked. "Did you sleep?" He looked up with a tired but amused smile. Enough. They sat side by side during the advisory call. It wasn't lost on Samantha that the tone had shifted. These were the same investors who, 2 days earlier, had barely made eye contact with her. Now they were attentive, collaborative. When Elias spoke, they didn't just listen, they deferred. They asked him about modeling scenarios, scalability bottlenecks, even UX feedback. And he answered in his usual tone, patient, precise, quietly confident. At one point, the lead advisor even said, "We're just glad you were in the room, Elias. You saved this pitch." Samantha felt a strange twist in her chest. Pride, yes, but also something sharper, more complex. Because the truth was, she had built the pitch, the product, the team, but he had saved it. Not by taking credit, not by demanding space, simply by speaking the truth with such clarity that everyone else had to stop and pay attention. And it made her realize that maybe her job now wasn't to prove herself anymore. Maybe it was to make space for him to keep doing what he was already doing. After the calls ended, they both stood in the kitchen, the weight of the day settling into their shoulders. "You know," she said, pouring a second cup of coffee, "you don't have to be the smartest person in every room." "I know," Elias said, grabbing a spoon to stir his tea. "I just can't help it." She laughed, not because it was a joke, but because it was true in the most unassuming way. He didn't posture. He didn't perform. He just saw what others missed, always had. Later that evening, Samantha stepped outside to water the plants on their little balcony. The city was quiet in that late-hour way that felt suspended, like everything had exhaled. She looked up at the windows across the street and wondered how many people in those buildings were chasing something: funding, approval, clarity. She remembered sitting in meetings years ago wishing someone would just take her seriously. And now, here she was, not only taken seriously, but backed, funded, and finally heard. But the most powerful thing she carried wasn't the term sheet or the cap table. It was the memory of that moment, in that pitch room, when her son had stood without hesitation, answered without ego, and rewrote the trajectory of everything. Inside, Elias had returned to the table. His tablet was open again. His fingers moved quickly, sketching out something new. Samantha watched him from the doorway, a quiet warmth settling in her chest. "What are you building now?" she asked. He didn't look up. "A better onboarding engine. I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about making it easier for companies to integrate without retraining staff. If I can automate more of the setup process, we reduce friction by like 30%. "Already thinking about version 2? I never stopped." She nodded. "Good, because now people are watching." He paused, then looked up. "I don't care if they're watching. I just want to make it work." And she knew in that moment that he wasn't just a smart kid. He was something more rare, someone who hadn't just learned how to solve problems. He'd learned how to stay focused on the problem, even when the world tried to turn him into a story. She crossed the room, kissed the top of his head, and said, "Then let's build it right." And he nodded, never once looking away from the work. Winter crept in without asking. One morning there were just frost-laced windows and breath fogging in the kitchen, and the faint creak of old pipes adjusting to the cold. Samantha made oatmeal while Elias sat at the counter, hood up, scrolling through a code with a spoon in his mouth and a mug of lukewarm tea beside him. The tablet was already open. He hadn't even looked at the oatmeal. His fingers tapped, paused, scrolled, highlighted. Another prototype build, another test case, another quiet sprint that would likely lead to something no one had seen coming, not even her. The weeks following the investor pitch had changed everything. The deal closed fast, faster than Samantha expected. The funding arrived. The expansion roadmap went from hypothetical to now. Suddenly, she wasn't just a founder with a vision, she was a leader with capital, responsibility, a team to scale, and answers to give. And people were watching her now. But more than that, they were watching Elias. They all wanted to know what he would do next. She tried to protect him from that. Keep the focus where it belonged. But he felt it, even if he didn't say it. It followed him everywhere now, in the questions people asked, in the way they looked at him just a second too long, in the expectations buried in every compliment. He handled it like he handled everything, quietly, directly. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't hungry for attention. He was trying to solve something real, something specific. And that morning, as snow gathered in lazy drifts outside and the city slowed to a hush, he was deep into his next problem. "The configuration wizard's still too slow," he said, not looking up. "Onboarding works if you already understand how to deploy it, but new clients? They're going to churn before they see value." Samantha poured herself a second cup of coffee. "You ran the time-to-value models again?" "3 times, Elias said. "The first time user experience needs to be rebuilt from scratch. No jargon, no acronyms, just a sequence that teaches as it works." "You want to rewrite the whole flow?" "I already started," he said. She sat beside him, looked over his shoulder. The screen displayed a new UI sketch, simple lines, clean paths, a soft color gradient that felt more welcoming than technical. He wasn't just designing software. He was designing trust. "This is good," she said. "If it needs to be better, you've done more than anyone expected." "That's not the benchmark." Samantha fell quiet. It wasn't that she didn't understand. She did. Too well. It was the same thing that drove her when no one believed in her first build, when she pitched V1 of StreamCore to empty rooms, when investors smiled politely and said, "Maybe next time." That drive never left. She had just gotten used to carrying it. Elias wore it differently. Not like pressure, like purpose. They worked through the day. One call bled into another. New team members onboarded. The first expansion contracts finalized. By mid-afternoon, the house had turned into a humming engine of output. Samantha managing stakeholders, aligning timelines, adjusting forecasts. Elias pushing changes, deploying tests, drafting documentation that read less like instructions and more like conversation. By evening, the sky had turned dark steel and the snow kept falling. Samantha sat by the window, sipping the last of her tea while Elias sprawled on the couch, sketchpad resting on his knees. He was drawing. Not code, not interface wireframes, but just lines. Geometric shapes layered over each other like something architectural, his version of unwinding. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't said anything in that pitch room?" she asked. He shrugged. "You would have closed the deal eventually." "I'm not so sure." He looked up. "You're the founder. You built the platform. I just translated it." "You didn't just translate it, Elias. You reframed it. You made it make sense to people who weren't ready to see it." He didn't reply, but he smiled, that quiet, almost embarrassed kind of smile that meant he was proud but didn't want to say so. She watched him for a moment longer, then asked, "What made you speak up?" He looked at her, and for a second he wasn't a kid or a coder or a prodigy. He was just himself, clear, steady. "They were wrong," he said. "I knew how to fix it, and if I didn't say something, we would have lost the shot, and I didn't want to watch them walk away from something I knew was true." Samantha nodded slowly. That was it. That was the heart of it. Not ego, not instinct, just truth, and the refusal to let it go unheard. "You saved it," she said. "We saved it." She stood, ruffled his hair, and turned toward the kitchen. He went back to his drawing. The snow fell deeper. The windows glowed with soft gold from the inside. And in a house full of silent movement and quiet work, two people kept building something worth being proud of, together. The new year began not with a bang, but with a subtle shift, something in the light, in the way the mornings unfolded with more clarity and less urgency. Samantha noticed it first in how Elias moved through the house. There was less pacing, fewer half-finished thoughts muttered under his breath. He had reached a kind of internal stability, not because things were easy now, but because something had finally settled. They had proven themselves. The company was funded. The product was growing. The right people were finally listening. And more than that, the right people were believing. By mid-January, StreamCore had tripled its enterprise interest. Not downloads, not buzz, real conversations, real pilots. It was the kind of momentum that made other founders nervous, excited, paranoid. Samantha took it in stride. She had waited years for this. Not just the funding, but the room to breathe, to build, to refine without begging for credibility. She was still the one holding the steering wheel. But now the road was open. The guardrails were up, and the passengers had stopped asking if she knew where she was going. Elias was in charge of the system architecture now. Not officially. He didn't want a title. But every new feature passed through his hands. Every roadmap discussion stopped at his desk. No one forced it. It just happened. Because he asked the right questions. Because when he found something fragile in the system, he didn't patch it. He rebuilt it. And people learned quickly that when Elias said something wouldn't scale, he wasn't guessing. He was warning them. One afternoon, Samantha walked into the office and found him on a call with a senior engineer, someone nearly twice his age, someone who had once said, half-jokingly, "If the kid wants to change the framework, he better come with benchmarks." Elias had, and now the engineer was leaning forward, eyes narrowed, taking notes. Elias wasn't cocky. He wasn't even assertive. He was just clear, measured, confident in a way that made even the most experienced professionals pause and reconsider their assumptions. After the call ended, Samantha sat beside him, handing him a bottle of water. He opened it, took a sip, and said, "They think I'm weird." She smiled. "You are weird." He raised an eyebrow. "But not the bad kind," she added. "The kind that sees the shape of a thing before it finishes forming. That's not weird, Elias. That's rare." He didn't answer, but she saw the corners of his mouth pull upward. The next big milestone came 2 weeks later. A logistics firm, mid-size, well-connected, notoriously picky, signed a multi-year contract after running StreamCore's middleware through a 3-week trial. Their head of engineering sent an internal note that got leaked, a single sentence that spread like wildfire across tech Twitter. "The kids' model shaved 21% off our load times and mapped optimizations our own team missed for years." Samantha didn't publicize it. She didn't have to. The reputation was already catching. People who had once scoffed at the idea of a founder bringing her son to an investor meeting now framed it as legendary foresight, visionary leadership. And it made her laugh sometimes how fast the narrative changed once the results were undeniable. She and Elias never talked about that day anymore, not directly, but its shadow stretched across everything, not in a heavy way, but in the way a hinge casts a line across a door, a point where everything turned. They both knew what had happened. They both remembered how it felt when the room shifted, when Elias stood up not to prove a point, but to make something clear, and how that clarity had carried them through every room since. They worked late most nights, sometimes together, sometimes apart. Samantha handled strategy, contracts, investor relations. Elias handled systems, design, performance. But in the quiet moments between meetings and builds, they would pause, maybe in the kitchen or on the porch or leaning back in their chairs after a long session, and they would just look at each other. And one of them would say, "This is working," and the other would nod. Not everything was perfect. There were still bugs, still disagreements, still the occasional condescending remark from someone who didn't realize the boy in the hoodie was the architect of the engine they were using. But those moments passed quickly now, because the results spoke, because the product worked, because the room always changed once Elias started talking. Samantha kept a folder on her desktop. She didn't open it often, but it was there. Inside were screenshots of the first pitch deck, the first rejection emails, a blurry photo someone had taken from the back of the room the day Elias spoke at the investor meeting. He looked impossibly young in the image, too small for the screen, too quiet for the room. But there he was, standing beside a projection of the data model that saved the company. She didn't keep the folder to dwell on the past. She kept it as proof. That clarity matters, that preparation matters, that bringing someone unexpected into the room might just change everything, that a pitch is only as powerful as the truth it reveals, and that sometimes when the stakes are high and the odds are low and the people at the table aren't listening, what you need isn't a louder voice. What you need is someone who can see what's broken and build something better in its place. And if that someone happens to be your son, so be it. Spring arrived like a breath exhaled, soft and slow, washing the city in green and gold. For the first time in months, the sunlight felt warm against the window glass, and Samantha found herself pausing mid-call to watch it flicker across the kitchen counter, catching in the steam of her coffee like a quiet invitation to slow down. Not that she did. There was too much happening. StreamCore had just passed a major milestone, deployment across 3 enterprise environments in a single week, and the feedback was rolling in fast and loud. Latency drops, integration time slashed, operational costs down by double digits. It was happening, finally. Not the dream of the product, not the idea of the solution, but the reality. StreamCore wasn't just working, it was changing things. And Elias? He was already ahead of it. He had started sketching version 2 before version 1 had even fully stabilized. New configurations, more flexible architecture, scalable modules that could learn as they deployed, not just from client feedback, but from usage trends and micro-decisions. He wasn't calling it machine learning. He didn't care about buzzwords. But it was something close, something real. And when he showed Samantha the early framework on his tablet one night after dinner, she stared at it for a long time before saying very quietly, "You're building something I never could have imagined." Elias just shrugged. "It's just the next step." But she knew it wasn't just that. It was the product of how he saw the world, not as a sequence of obstacles to overcome, but as a constantly shifting structure of problems that needed understanding before they needed fixing. She had always been good at building, but Elias had an instinct for seeing the invisible seams, where the pressure was gathering, where the system would fracture next if no one paid attention. He didn't fight problems. He listened to them, and then he solved them in silence. He was still quiet in meetings, even now. Investors tried to draw him out with praise or performance questions, but he rarely played along. He spoke when he had something to say, and when he did, everyone listened. There was no bluster, no polish, just fact, data, clarity, and underneath it all, a calm certainty that made even the most skeptical stakeholders pause and lean in. Samantha watched it unfold over and over again. How the room changed the moment Elias opened his mouth. How assumptions slipped away and posture melted into respect. He didn't win them over with charm. He didn't need to. He won them with truth. One particular afternoon stood out. They were presenting to a prospective partner, an enormous firm with global reach and a reputation for cutting deals and cutting ties. Samantha had prepped for days, aligning value propositions, customizing demo cases, anticipating every possible objection. The meeting began smoothly, polite nods, generic questions, the usual passive resistance that came from executives used to seeing too many startups in too little time. Then Elias opened his laptop. He walked them through a live diagnostic from one of their most recent clients. No slides, no filters, just raw data showing how StreamCore had identified a hidden inefficiency in the client's operations, something the client's internal team had missed for 5 years. It was subtle, a memory allocation bug causing a 5-second delay every time a certain system ran a redundant background check. Harmless, on paper. But across millions of calls, that delay added up to tens of thousands of wasted hours per year. And Elias had found it within 2 days of deployment. He showed them the fix, the performance gain, the dollar value. Then he paused, looked at the executives around the table and said, "You're probably losing similar time. If you let us look, we'll find it." No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then the head of technology leaned forward and said, "Can we sign today?" That night, as they walked home through the soft dusk and the city's hum pulsed gently around them, Samantha turned to Elias and asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up in that pitch room?" Elias didn't look at her, just kept walking, but his voice was clear. "I think about it all the time." Samantha nodded. So did she. It had been almost a year since that moment, the moment they laughed, the moment he stood up, the moment everything shifted. She still remembered how small he had looked in that room, how young, how easy it had been for them to dismiss him with a smirk or a joke or a look that said, "This is not your place." But he had made it his place, not with force, with precision, with quiet certainty and a better answer than anyone else had brought. She never told him how close she had come to calling off the meeting that morning, how worried she had been about being taken seriously, how afraid she was that bringing her son might make them doubt her. She had almost left him at home. She was so glad she hadn't. They reached the front steps. The porch light buzzed on automatically. Elias dug for his keys. Samantha watched him, this boy who wasn't a boy anymore, not really, not after what he'd done, not after what he kept doing. He was still just a kid in worn sneakers and a hoodie too big for his frame. But he had saved a company, built a product, reframed an industry conversation, and he was still building, still thinking, still walking ahead. As they stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind them, she thought, not for the first time, about all the people who had laughed, and how none of them were laughing now. The days began to blur after a while. Not in a way that felt chaotic, more like the difference between chapters and paragraphs disappearing once you're deep inside a good book. Morning meetings flowed into product sprints, which turned into impromptu debugging sessions and long silent hours where Elias sat cross-legged on the living room floor, his laptop resting on one knee, cables trailing from a nearby modem into an open testing rig he'd cobbled together from spare parts. The coffee pot never seemed to empty, and the whiteboard in the hallway was always half erased and half filled again, layered with new ideas before the old ones had even been crossed out. Samantha had never known a rhythm like this before. It wasn't startup chaos. It wasn't the grind. It was something more alive, more patient, more surgical. It was the slow, steady hum of getting it right. Every week brought a new milestone. A new client signed. A new use case emerged. A new recommendation arrived from an unexpected source. The latest came from a CTO at a shipping conglomerate who had written in a LinkedIn post without fanfare that StreamCore identified a flaw or so in our predictive system that we didn't even realize was a flaw. It didn't just optimize, it revealed us to ourselves. Samantha read that line twice, then again, letting the words settle into her chest like warmth. She didn't forward the post. She didn't celebrate it publicly. She simply printed it and tucked it into a folder she kept in the top drawer of her desk, labeled quietly in black pen. Proof. Meanwhile, Elias was already 3 problems ahead. He was working on a redundancy detection module, something elegant and small, but transformative in its implications. It didn't just spot inefficient code. It traced patterns of unnecessary logic created by old workflows and taught the system how to collapse them into smarter, smaller functions without compromising integrity. He described it to Samantha one night over dinner as an immune system for the codebase. And she knew then that the project had already taken on a life bigger than both of them. They were still a small team, purposefully so. Samantha didn't want to scale too fast. They were too close to something precise, something that required care. But the weight of attention was growing. Investors began offering more than funding. They wanted advisory roles, preferential shares, brand equity. Other companies began circling, hinting at partnerships, at acquisitions, at accelerated integration paths. Samantha said no to almost all of them, not because she didn't need help, but because she wasn't going to let them take this out of Elias's hands. She wouldn't let them fold his clarity into their noise. One morning, they received an email from a product lead at a firm that had passed on them months earlier. The tone was humble, almost apologetic. They had seen what StreamCore had become. They were impressed. They wanted another meeting. Samantha read the message, then turned her chair to face Elias, who was lying on the carpet with a mechanical pencil in one hand and his sketch pad in the other. "They want to talk again," she said. He didn't look up. "The ones who said we didn't have market depth?" "Yeah?" He drew a line. "Tell them we're still building depth. They can wait." She smiled. "You're allowed to gloat a little." "I'm busy," he said. He wasn't being rude. He was just already somewhere else in his head, following a thread that would lead, in a few days, to a new logic cluster they would end up deploying as a patch and later calling foundational. That night, as the house settled into its usual hush and the world outside quieted beneath the weight of spring rain, Samantha walked into the living room to find Elias asleep on the couch, arms crossed over his chest, laptop still open beside him. The screen showed a simulation mid-run. Blocks of live data moving like traffic along invisible roads, all of it humming through the framework of something that used to be just an idea. She didn't wake him. She just sat on the armrest and watched the screen, watched the system he had imagined move and breathe and solve. She remembered how it had all started, the skepticism, the smirks, the man in the pitch meeting who laughed when she introduced Elias. The others, who nodded politely, said thank you for your time and never called back. They had seen a kid with a tablet. They hadn't seen the mind beneath it, the questions, the hours, the precision. They hadn't seen what Samantha had always known. Elias didn't just have talent. He had a rare and terrifying clarity. He didn't guess. He saw. And when he showed them finally what he saw, they had no choice but to follow. She reached out and gently closed his laptop, careful not to disturb the simulation. Then she draped a blanket over his shoulders, turned off the overhead light, and sat down nearby. In the dark, the only glow came from the blinking router lights and the faint pulse of a system that shouldn't have existed, but did. Because one boy had spoken up, because he hadn't waited for permission, because when they laughed, He answered with something stronger than confidence. He answered with the truth. By early summer, the momentum had become a quiet force of its own. Samantha no longer had to chase attention, meetings, or partnerships. They arrived in her inbox daily, preloaded with context and admiration, with phrases like, "We've been following your progress closely," and "Your son's insights were unlike anything we've seen." But she didn't rush. She didn't fold under the weight of interest. She managed the same way she always had: calm, strategic, clear-eyed. What had changed most wasn't the work, but the way the world finally treated her like it mattered. Like she mattered. Like what she built was no longer a long shot or a novelty, but a piece of infrastructure in the making. And Elias? He was working on something he hadn't told anyone about, not even her. She noticed it in the margins: extra logs running on his personal server, a new sketch pad tucked under his bed with layers of diagrams far too advanced to be just idle doodling. There were changes in his energy, too, a kind of controlled anticipation. He wasn't restless. He was composed, focused, like someone who knew exactly where he was going and just needed the rest of the world to catch up. When she finally asked, he didn't dodge. "I'm building a translator," he said one evening over dinner, as casually as if he were telling her the weather. She blinked. "Like a language translator?" "No, like a system translator. Something that sits between bad assumptions and good ones. Something that takes what decision-makers think they know and rephrases it in a way their systems can actually use." She set down her fork. "Why?" He didn't pause. "Because we keep optimizing for problems that weren't defined clearly. Every client we've had, every company, they're all asking the wrong questions. So they build wrong answers. And then they wonder why nothing scales." She leaned back in her chair, her chest tight with the kind of awe that only comes from watching someone walk directly into the future with no hesitation. He continued. "The translator uses behavior modeling. It reads how an executive interacts with performance data, then rewrites that data into a format their teams can act on without confusion. It doesn't fix decisions. It fixes how decisions land." Samantha was silent for a long moment. Finally she said, "You're not just optimizing systems anymore." Elias looked up. "I'm optimizing people." They spent the next month building the prototype. Late nights turned into early mornings. The table was covered in crumbs and wires and paper coffee cups with phrases like "run context again" and "clarify intent weight" scrawled across their sides. Samantha handled the client interfacing module, translating Elias's ideas into something an organization could onboard without 3 hours of training. Elias focused on the back-end logic, refining the behavior model to respond dynamically, not just to data points, but to tone, to hesitation, to misuse of metrics. They called it PRISM, because it took in white light, complex, unfocused information, and split it into something clearer, something defined. They didn't announce PRISM with a press release. They didn't post about it. They deployed it in secret to 2 pilot clients under NDA. The results were immediate. One company reversed a planned hiring freeze within 2 weeks after PRISM rephrased their projected churn data to highlight workforce inefficiencies, not personnel surplus. Another scrapped a $1 million restructuring initiative after PRISM revealed the initiative was based on a misunderstanding of user retention data. The system didn't make decisions, it reframed truth. One executive sent an email 3 lines long. "This would have saved us 5 years of bad meetings. Please don't sell this to our competitors." Word spread anyway. By the end of the month, 7 more companies requested demos. By the end of the quarter, 20. At first, Samantha tried to pace the growth. She knew what scale too fast could do, but PRISM had become something else. A new tier of StreamCore's foundation. A new language for operational clarity, and it was built by a boy who had once been laughed at for daring to walk into a room full of adults and speak. Elias didn't gloat. He didn't remind her of that moment, but she did. Often, she remembered the way he had stood, small but certain, tablet in hand, and made the entire room tilt toward him, not with noise, with precision, with clarity, with the kind of truth that makes arrogance step aside and say, "Go ahead." Now, when he walked into a room, people stood to greet him. They called him the architect. They invited him to panels and keynotes and closed-door roundtables. He said no to almost all of them. "I'm not trying to be a face," he said. "I'm trying to finish the work." And he did, every day. One night, Samantha came home late from a strategy session and found him asleep at the dining table, a blanket over his shoulders, a blinking cursor on the screen. She sat down beside him, read the last lines of code he'd written. It wasn't syntax, it was a comment. Let the system explain itself before anyone else tries to. She stared at it until the monitor dimmed. Then she whispered to no one and to everything, "They're not laughing anymore, Elias." And she was right. They weren't. They were listening. The quiet after Prism launched wasn't truly silence. It was observation. Companies were watching closely, studying each case study, each testimonial, each drop in operational chaos that followed implementation. Prism didn't fix people's mistakes. That was never the point. What it did was far more unnerving to traditional leadership. It made them confront exactly how and why they had misunderstood their own systems. And that kind of confrontation, Elias explained one morning as he pulled apart a report on his second monitor, was a soft revolution, not a coup, a mirror. Samantha noticed how different the tone was from earlier product launches. With StreamCore's base platform, they'd faced friction, hesitation, resistance, disguised as caution. But with Prism, the reaction wasn't skepticism, it was caution disguised as awe. No one dared say it wouldn't work. Instead, they treaded carefully, as though afraid to look directly at what the system was telling them. After all, it wasn't blaming them, it wasn't shaming them, it was just showing them exactly what they'd built. The good, the bad, the fragile. At home, things were as grounded as ever. Samantha kept her morning rituals intact. Coffee before sunrise, notebook open beside her mug, emails read in silence, while Elias adjusted variables in another room. The two of them communicating mostly in thought patterns and unfinished sentences that still somehow made complete sense. Their house had become a rhythm of motion and clarity, with music always low in the background, and tablets charging on every surface. Elias rarely left without a sketch pad, and when he wasn't at his workstation, he could usually be found outside on the steps, writing in the margins of his own ideas like someone refining a language only he could hear. One evening, Samantha received a call from an education think tank in Boston. They wanted to license a stripped-down version of Prism for student performance modeling, not for grading, but for understanding behavioral learning patterns and communication gaps in classrooms. She almost dismissed it as a stretch, until Elias overheard the conversation and said, without lifting his head from his screen, "That makes sense. Classrooms are just distributed systems. Kids don't underperform, systems underrecognize." Samantha paused. "You want to help them design it?" He nodded. "Only if they promise not to use it for rankings, only visibility, nothing punitive." That was the thing about Elias. Even when what he built could be weaponized, against employees, students, teams, he designed it to resist that instinct. His systems didn't just show failure, they showed how failure started, and they showed a path out. 2 weeks later, a school district signed on, then 2 more. By the time summer tipped toward fall, Prism's educational variant, quietly renamed Echo by Elias, was piloting in 12 institutions. The feedback was extraordinary. One principal wrote to say that a student who had been labeled disruptive for years was finally understood, because the system highlighted how often his behavior spiked only after group work sessions with peers who consistently misinterpreted his body language. "We always thought he was the problem," the principal wrote. "Now we're realizing we never once looked at how we were creating the conditions." Samantha printed that email too, folded it into the same folder with the rest. The recognition continued to grow. Offers poured in. One firm wanted to acquire StreamCore outright. Another suggested folding Prism into their enterprise software suite, with Elias as Chief Intelligence Officer, a title designed more to flatter than to function. They declined every offer. Not because the money wasn't life-changing, it was, but because neither Samantha nor Elias had built any of this to be sold. This wasn't a product to them. It was a language, a new way of seeing. But the attention brought new complications. There were interviews requested, awards proposed, conference panels begging for a soundbite. Elias refused them all, not rudely, just plainly. "If I'm on a stage," he said once, "I'm not at the table fixing the next thing." Samantha supported him, but she also worried, not about his focus, but about the loneliness that could come with clarity. So few people understood the way he thought. Even fewer knew how to speak to it. Most just marveled, like he was an exhibit in a museum built for problems they didn't think had solutions. She didn't want him to be revered. She wanted him to be heard. So she carved out small spaces, intentional rooms with thoughtful collaborators. She brought in systems thinkers, pattern theorists, behavioral modelers, people who asked questions instead of pitching partnerships, people who weren't afraid to be challenged. Elias responded to those people. He debated with them, learned from them. He even smiled sometimes, not often, but enough. One afternoon, after a 3-hour strategy session with a civic tech lab, Elias sat across from her at the kitchen table, stirring cold tea. "You ever think about the pitch?" he asked. She looked up from her screen. "Which one?" "The one?" he said. "The laugh." She didn't need more detail. "I think about it less than I used to," she said, "but it's never gone." "Do you wish I hadn't stood up?" She blinked. "Do you?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "No, but sometimes I wonder if that was the moment I stopped being a kid." Samantha looked at him for a long time. "You didn't stop," she said. You just started being seen. That's not the same thing." He nodded, still stirring his tea. "I just wanted them to understand." "They did," she said, "eventually." He met her eyes. "Now what?" She reached across the table, laid her hand over his. "Now we build something that helps people understand each other before they have to stand up." He exhaled, soft, long. "Okay," he said, "then we start tonight." And they did. The night they started the new build, the air outside was unusually still, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if the world knew something important was about to begin and didn't want to interrupt. Inside the house, lights glowed softly from every corner, desk lamps in both bedrooms, the hallway light left on low, the living room dim but warm, humming with the low buzz of idle machines. Samantha sat cross-legged on the couch, her laptop balanced against one knee, the edges of 3 whiteboards visible behind her, all covered in looping arrows and sketched-out interface paths. Elias sat on the floor, blanket draped over his shoulders like a cape, his tablet in one hand and a stylus twirling absent-mindedly between his fingers. They had no name for the project yet, only a question. What would it look like to build a system that noticed the small things first? Not the obvious breakdowns, not the critical failures, but the subtle misalignments, the early signs of friction between people and process, the moment someone disengaged, not out of malice, but confusion. The missed signal before the missed deadline, the unread message that meant more than it seemed. The hesitation during a conversation where one party was already carrying too much weight and the other hadn't realized they'd dropped it. It started with a sentence Elias had written in the margin of a paper weeks earlier, one Samantha hadn't seen until she found the page folded between drafts of a presentation. It read, "Systems fail the same way people do, quietly first." She circled it, left it on his desk with a note. He said nothing, but that night he opened a fresh build environment and began laying out a foundation. They worked in sync without discussing it. They always had. Samantha built the interaction layer, an input system designed not for efficiency, but for nuance. It allowed users to log not just data, but doubt, a place to record uncertainty without needing to categorize it. Elias built the logic engine to interpret those soft entries, layering contextual weight onto them. If someone marked a decision with "unsure" 3 times in a row, the system flagged it, not as an error, but as an inflection point, a place where leadership should pause, where someone should ask a question, not give a command. They called the engine threshold. It didn't alert when things were wrong. It alerted when things were tipping, when a person was about to withdraw from a process they no longer believed in, when a team's trust started to erode, not because of failure, but because of silence. Threshold wasn't loud. It didn't send red banners or blinking warnings. It waited. Then it whispered. The first tests were internal. Samantha ran it against old company logs, meeting notes, update memos, timelines from companies that had collapsed after cultural scandals or poor leadership. Threshold caught signals every time, a buried comment in a product spec that hinted at resource strain, an email thread where a junior staffer asked the same clarifying question 3 times and never got a reply, a calendar gap between meetings that should have been continuous. Everything that broke, Elias said after one run, broke 5 steps before anyone admitted it. Samantha nodded. Then that's when we start watching. They debated what to call it. It wasn't a warning system, not a tracker, not a monitor. Those words all implied judgment. They weren't building a system to expose. They were building one to notice. Eventually, they settled on a name neither of them had to say out loud. It had been on the back of Samantha's notebook for weeks, circled 3 times. Pulse, because that's what it listened for. The feeling of a system beginning to shift, the slight irregularity, the skipped beat. They layered in visibility rules. Pulse never blamed. It only shared context. It offered insights like team alignment decreased after shift in meeting cadence, or this decision has more friction than average. Would you like to know where? It never said why. It invited the user to ask. It created space for questions, not conclusions. By the end of the first month, Pulse had already revealed truths about their own small team they hadn't seen. Samantha realized she'd stopped checking in with their 3rd developer after reducing syncs. Elias saw that one of his project logs hadn't been updated in 2 weeks, not because he was behind, but because he hadn't noticed how his attention had narrowed. Pulse didn't judge them. It reminded them to look. Word began to spread before they were ready. A colleague asked to try it. Then another. Soon, Pulse was in limited alpha across 5 pilot teams in 3 industries: healthcare, education, fintech. The feedback was unlike anything they'd received before. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about people saying things like, "I didn't realize how tired my team was until I saw how many decisions were being marked with hesitation," or "I never knew how often I postponed the same conversation until Pulse showed me the pattern." Samantha and Elias didn't frame the system as revolutionary. They framed it as restorative, a way to return attention to the places it had quietly slipped away from, a way to rebuild confidence, not with certainty, but with care. And more than anything, a way to prevent systems from failing in the first place, not because someone blew a whistle or found a flaw, but because someone listened early enough. Late one night, Samantha stood by Elias's doorway watching him finish another commit. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing a note into the changelog. Not a technical one, just 5 words. Pause is part of progress. She didn't say anything, just stepped away, smiling. Because once again, He had built something the world didn't know it needed. And once again, they would learn. Autumn turned the edges of everything golden. The leaves along their street burned in deep oranges and reds, drifting into piles that Elias occasionally kicked apart on his walks just for the sound it made. The house smelled of cinnamon, electric heat, and solder, his desk now cluttered with prototype boards, wires, and 2 new projects that hadn't been named yet but already had gravity. Samantha had started spending more time by the window again, working with her tablet in her lap, headphones on, watching the leaves fall, while emails stacked up in her inbox with subject lines like, "Requesting demo access," and "When can we license Pulse for onboarding?" The system they built to notice quiet shifts had become the loudest thing in the room. They hadn't even launched it formally. Pulse lived, as all their projects did, in the space between momentum and invitation. It hadn't gone viral. It had gone necessary. People didn't write press articles about it. They sent stories, short, quiet messages about things it had helped them notice. A team member pulling back after 3 unacknowledged updates. A senior staffer losing confidence in their own decisions. An entire division beginning to echo tension that no one had named. "Pulse doesn't scream," one user wrote. "It taps your shoulder. It says, gently, maybe look here." Elias read every message. He kept them in a private log, indexed not by sender or organization, but by theme. He categorized each one by what it revealed: hesitation, fatigue, uncertainty, alignment, drift. Not to quantify them, he hated that word, but to understand how systems lose coherence without anyone noticing. He was obsessed, but not in a frantic way. His was the kind of obsession that looked like meditation, slow, deliberate, expansive. He moved from room to room without urgency, pencil in hand, sketching models that predicted emotional wear across decision chains. His language was changing, Samantha noticed. Less about code, more about culture. One day she asked him, "What are you building now?" He didn't look up from his notepad. "A way to show people what respect looks like in data." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Most systems only track performance or conflict. They don't track how often people accommodate each other, how often someone quietly steps back so another person can move forward. That's where trust lives, in the invisible adjustments." She sat with that. "And you think you can model that?" "I think I already have," he said. He showed her the framework a few nights later. It wasn't visual yet, just layers of language and feedback loops that captured behavioral shifts inside teams. But the logic was clear. If someone changed their approach 3 times in a week to make another person's decision easier, that wasn't indecision. That was collaboration. Pulse would track it, recognize the pattern, and highlight it. Not to reward or gamify, but simply to say, "This happened. You may not have seen it, but it mattered." Samantha felt a kind of stillness when he explained it, the kind that comes when you realize someone has thought about something longer and deeper than anyone else has dared to. She remembered again the boy who stood in that investor meeting with 2 big sleeves and a tablet full of unrequested brilliance, the one they tried to laugh out of the room, and how that boy had never raised his voice, not once, but had shifted everything anyway. Now that boy was building systems that could recognize grace. Word of Pulse spread to government teams. One agency reached out to say they were considering using it to monitor stress patterns during policy rollouts, not for metrics, but to know when to slow down. Another requested a stripped version to test in emergency response teams, to quietly flag moments when a leader was on the verge of burnout before they made a bad call. Elias agreed on one condition: no punishment systems. If they were going to use Pulse, they had to use it as a mirror, not a weapon. And to their surprise, most agreed. Samantha knew then that Pulse wasn't just a product. It was a philosophy, one that had emerged from the same instinct that made Elias speak in that pitch room all that time ago. That unwillingness to let bad decisions stand when the truth was sitting quietly at the edge of the table, waiting to be acknowledged. She got another message that week, this time from someone who had been in that room. The man hadn't spoken much back then. She barely remembered him, but his email was long, thoughtful, honest. I didn't say anything when they laughed, and I've regretted that ever since. I didn't understand what I was watching, but now I do. Your son didn't just save the pitch, he changed how I listen. Pulse is just an extension of that moment. The moment someone unexpected told the truth, and I realized how long I'd been looking in the wrong direction. She didn't show the email to Elias. She didn't need to. That night, as they sat on the porch, a soft breeze moving through the branches above, she turned to him and said, "They're still learning." He didn't ask who, he just nodded. "Good?" And then they fell quiet, watching the leaves fall slowly in the dark, both of them thinking maybe about the next thing waiting to be built. The last leaves fell slowly, one by one, drifting in loops across the sidewalk like they had nowhere urgent to be. The air turned colder each morning, and Elias started pulling on thicker sweaters, without being asked, sometimes layered over T-shirts from past product builds, soft and worn from too many late nights spent hunched over a keyboard. The heat clicked on in the house in short bursts, and with it came a new quiet, the kind Samantha recognized not as stillness, but as incubation. It was how every important thing began. Not with noise, but with the space around it getting tighter, more intentional. Focus folding inward like the moment before something breaks through. Elias was designing something new. She could tell because he wasn't talking about it. He moved through the house differently, slower but more exact. He erased things from the whiteboard and didn't replace them. He left his tablet charging more often, which meant the work was happening in his head before it hit the screen. Samantha didn't press him. She just kept the coffee warm, cleared space on the kitchen table, and waited. She had learned long ago that his best ideas weren't spoken until they were nearly complete. It was during one of their morning syncs, no agenda, just mutual presence over toast and screens, that he finally said, without lifting his eyes from a page of sketched architecture, "I'm thinking about reconciliation." Samantha paused. "As in financial?" "No, as in between people, between roles, between decisions that were right at the time but wrong in hindsight." She set her mug down. "You want to build a system for that?" "I think I already started," he said, flipping the page. "It's an extension of Pulse, or maybe a counterweight. Pulse tells us where systems are slipping. This would show people how to repair the slide after it happens." She leaned forward. "How do you build for reconciliation?" "By showing what changed and who changed and where the gap grew." He showed her the model. It tracked decisions over time, not just the choices themselves, but the emotional logic behind them, captured through language, response time, revision patterns, silence. It didn't judge outcomes. It mapped dissonance. If two collaborators started on the same page but diverged slowly, the system recorded where the split happened. Then it offered not solutions, but shared context, what each side knew, assumed, and misunderstood. Elias called it context stitching. Samantha sat back, stunned. "You're building a memory engine." Elias nodded. "Most systems document decisions. I want to document misunderstandings. That's where the real cost lives." They called it thread. It wasn't elegant, not yet, but it was real, and they both felt it, the weight of what it could mean, not just for teams and companies, but for people trying to do their best inside imperfect systems. Thread didn't just tell you what went wrong. It let you see what it felt like to be the other person. In the moment, things began to slip. As they worked, stories poured in, not from new clients, but from people who had been using Pulse for months. Stories about friction quietly resolved. Meetings that shifted when someone noticed the hesitation, pulse surfaced. One user wrote, "For the first time in a decade, I understood why my teammate checked out last year. We weren't in conflict. We were on different maps." Another shared, "We used pulse data to have the conversation we'd been avoiding for months. It didn't fix everything, but it started something better." Samantha forwarded that one to Elias. He didn't reply. But she saw him later, staring out the window with that look he always had when something aligned deep inside him. Not satisfaction, alignment. Thread became a private beta, tested only with teams who had already built trust with Pulse. The results were nuanced, slow, and profound. Fewer decisions were reversed. More meetings ended with clarity. One company discovered that their highest-performing team wasn't the one with the most output, but the one with the smallest delta between stated intent and actual outcome. Samantha called that congruence tracking. Elias called it truth surfacing. It didn't go unnoticed. In December, a quiet article appeared in a systems design journal. Nothing flashy, no bylines, just an in-depth study on emerging patterns in organizational self-awareness. Thread was mentioned only once, in a footnote, but it sparked something. 2 weeks later, a sociologist reached out, then a restorative justice nonprofit, then a labor mediation group. They didn't want Thread for control, they wanted it for healing. And Samantha, reading each new request, felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just software anymore. It was invitation, a way for people who'd broken something, not out of harm, but exhaustion, misalignment, fear, to come back to the table. One night they sat on the couch with tea, and the lights dimmed low. Elias had his feet pulled under him, blanket over his shoulders, laptop open, but idle. Samantha read quietly, then finally said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd let them keep talking? Back in that room, the pitch?" Elias didn't move. "They would have passed, and we wouldn't have built any of this." He was quiet for a long time, then he said, softly, "Maybe. Or maybe we would have anyway, just slower, with more friction, less trust." She nodded. "But we didn't wait." "No," he said, we told the truth, and the work did the rest." Outside, snow started to fall, thick and steady. Inside, something continued to grow, not loudly, not quickly, but deeply. And in that quiet, safe space built on clarity, repair, and relentless honesty, the next answer was already beginning. The snow didn't stop for 3 days. It fell in heavy layers, soft and slow, covering everything in a white stillness that made the world outside their windows feel like it was paused. Inside, time moved differently, not in minutes or meetings, but in breakthroughs, in the quiet calibration of something new. The house hummed with heat and the occasional soft clack of keys. Elias, cross-legged on the floor with his headphones on, and a notepad balanced on one knee. Samantha at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and open tabs on her laptop. Every few hours, one of them would say, "Come look at this," and the other would get up, barefoot on cold floors, tea forgotten on the counter, eyes focused. Thread had shifted again. It wasn't just a system for stitching together misunderstanding anymore. It was becoming a pattern recognition tool for emotional drift. The idea started with a single line Elias wrote across the top of a whiteboard. People don't just miscommunicate. They misremember how aligned they used to be. From there, it evolved into something more ambitious and more dangerous, something that tracked not just when two decision paths diverged, but when they diverged silently, without acknowledgement, when assumptions changed, when priorities bent inward, when roles subtly redefined themselves without any meeting or memo. It happened all the time, Elias said, especially on teams that trusted each other too much to check in. He built a model to detect it. He called it the divergence curve. Samantha watched the first prototype render across the screen and felt something catch in her chest. The curve wasn't dramatic. It didn't spike. It sloped. A slow, graceful arc, showing how intent and impact quietly became misaligned. And Thread's job, he explained, wasn't to blame anyone for that slope. It was to let them see it before it hardened into resentment, fatigue, or loss. They tested the model with 2 beta clients. Both teams thought they were functioning smoothly. Both were shocked by what Thread surfaced. Not failure, not conflict, just distance. A product manager who had stopped asking for design input 3 weeks ago. A tech lead who assumed everyone was okay with the new schedule because no one pushed back. A junior dev who hadn't shared a concern about performance since the last sprint because their comment had been misunderstood once and they didn't want to risk it again. Every team, Samantha said one night, rereading the user feedback, is holding their breath somewhere. Elias nodded. We just show them where. As Thread grew, so did the questions. Could it be used in education, in long-distance collaboration? Could it model relationships between departments, not just individuals? Could it tell when an organization was beginning to pretend more than it listened? The answer increasingly was yes. But Samantha moved carefully. She'd seen too many tools repurposed into surveillance, too many insights turned into weapons. She built the interface with Elias's guidance, and together they added fail-safes, language controls, blind spot limits, reflection thresholds. Thread could reveal, but only if the user asked. It couldn't be forced. It could only be invited. They didn't call it a product. They called it a conversation starter. It wasn't long before one of the early partners used Thread data to call a team-wide retreat. Not because of a scandal, not because of collapse, just because the divergence curve had grown too wide, too long, too quietly. They spent 3 days talking. Thread didn't tell them what to fix. It showed them where they'd stopped talking. That was enough. Samantha and Elias read the debrief in silence. At the end of the message was a single line. We remembered we still liked each other. That night, Elias stood at the window, hands in his sweatshirt pockets, watching the snow fall like static. Samantha came up beside him, coffee in hand, and asked, "Do you know what you're doing yet?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, "I think we're trying to prove something." She raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" That clarity isn't cold. That structure doesn't have to erase compassion. That maybe if we built systems that paid attention to the soft edges, people wouldn't have to harden themselves just to survive. She said nothing. She just reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder. "You're building a language," she said, "for things we stopped naming a long time ago." He turned to her, eyes tired but steady. "You built the grammar first." She smiled. "I just made space. You filled it." The snow kept falling. Thread kept growing, quietly, precisely. Not solving every problem, just showing people the ones they didn't know they'd started ignoring. And that, somehow, was enough.